Oh, hello, guys. I don't know what's going on. No one is connected now. Yeah, someone is connected. So, yeah, well, not many people are getting the message that we were having this lecture today, and I wonder why. Today is an important day, though, because I'm going to, well, first, this is the last lecture of the term of this course. And on top of that, I'm going to distribute um, the questions for the final exam. Um, who is connected now? Do you mind sending me a message? I am waiting. Oh, just one person. Anyway, yeah, I'll just proceed as planned. Hello, everyone. So, against all odds, we made it. This is the last lecture of this course that in this very odd term. I tried to do as the best I could, to keep things going. And I hope the objectives of the course were nonetheless achieved in spite of the obstacles and the limitations. And again, sorry about the interruption of the lecture last week. I didn't notice I was offline until over half an hour once later when the connection was lost. You probably noticed that I posted the slides of the missing part in e-class, so you guys can consult them. And even if it's not, the full explanation that I offered here, it can still provide the basic information for you to check it out. I also want to tell you that after the lecture today, I'm going to distribute the final exam questions so you can have access to them in e-class. And you can tell me right away if you have any questions, any doubts on how the exam is going to be answered. I remind you that according to plan, the way that the organization of the course was set from the outset, the exam is due 1 week from now. That is to say, Tuesday, April 14th. You can send them by email anytime. There is no time restriction anymore as long as I receive the exam on the day that it is due. So today we're going to talk about the last unit in this course, which is about the Latin American innovations in the area of foreign policy. This is closely related to the foreign trade. This is closely related to the lecture that I gave last week that was more focused on foreign policy. And I will be using two readings, the one written by Andy Knight, myself, and Hamid Ghani, and also another reading written by Peter Rashish. So here we go. Um, so the big question that I want to answer today is, to what extent Latin American countries have contributed to change the practice and the rules of the game of international trade. Um, so the first part of the first reading, the night reading, is trying to set the background. And I won't go in great detail there because it very much repeats what the previous reading last week had already explained, the one written by Joseph Tolchin about the decline of hegemony of the United States in Latin America, and how there was more contestation, more concern of Latin American countries about the dominance of the United States in the area. So even though there were some attempts made at, capturing the leadership again in the post-Cold War era in Latin America, and then the efforts made by the Obama administration to um, carry out a rapprochement of sorts with Latin America. In the end, the strategy was not very successful. One of the major areas that was part of the foreign policy initiated in the United States was a trade policy. Trade policy, as you might remember, failed with when the free trade of the Americas was rejected in 2005 in a summit in Mar del Plata in Argentina, with the active collaboration between Brazil, Venezuela, and Argentina, that jointly, the three presidents at the time, jointly rejected the agreement, and that sent the agreement crashing. So then a U.S. trade representative, a man called Robert Zoellick, that would be later appointed head of the World Bank, he decided, well, that's fine. We don't need to have this multilateral trade agreement that we wanted to have, because after all, and I quote him, free trade with the United States is not a right, it is a privilege. So he was saying, if countries want to create free trade agreements with us, it is fine. They're welcome to do that. If they don't want, that's fine. So we're going to proceed one by one, inviting countries in the Americas to have trade agreements with us, to create a sort of coalition of liberalizers. That's, again, his words. He, of course, was borrowing the term that George Bush Jr., his boss at the time, had created, the coalition of the willing, when he was trying to get support for the invasion of Iraq. In this case, Robert Zoellick, the U.S. trade representative, wanted to enlist the countries that would be willing to sign free trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, that is, with the United States, in order to proceed with the strategy. Of course, signing bilateral agreements is not the same thing as having multilateral agreements, because of the size of the market, or the size of the corporations from the U.S. side. In fact, Robert Zoellick, what he proposed, what he was putting in practice, was a divide and conquer strategy, in order to gain the support of governments and countries that were willing to participate in trade liberalization, and leaving the others aside. So thanks to this strategy, the United States was able to get trade agreements with Mexico through NAFTA, with Chile, with Dominican Republic, with Central America, all the countries of Central America, with Peru, with Colombia, and with Panama. So those who didn't like the U.S. approach, those who didn't like liberal trade liberalization, could uh, be outside the coalition if they wanted, but this wouldn't get in the way of the United States of building a new regime or promoting free trade as a way of relating to the rest of the world and the Americas in particular. Um, Other than trade liberalization, the United States also used drug enforcement to create some type of relationship, some type of interdependent relationship with Latin America, in particular with Colombia and Mexico. I mentioned last week the plans that were put in place with those countries to provide in-kind help for drug enforcement in exchange for cooperation with the goals of the United States in the area. But overall, the strategies were not dictating the general relationships of Latin America with the United States, and they were unable to recreate the dominance, the hegemony of the United States over Latin America. So the early 2000s, as in other areas that we have discussed in this course, were a period of very creative, finding very creative solutions from the part of Latin American countries. In this case, alternatives to the dominance of the United States and alternatives to Washington consensus. This set of policies that the U.S. government and the international financial institutions wanted Latin America to follow. So the strategy for getting off the grip of the United States and finding kind of new avenues, new alternatives to the Washington consensus was the creation of horizontal alliances in Latin America. That is to say, instead of reproducing the hierarchical top-down relationship that had been kind of the standard way of organizing inter-American relations since the Cold War. Now countries would kind of ignore the U.S. leadership and try to create alliances among themselves. This is what explains the title of the book, where the first reading was taken from, the remapping of the Americas, a new way of relating the different countries in the area in order to create more horizontal, more equal relations, and perhaps more importantly, more attuned to the actual needs of the countries of the region. So there were four main drivers, four main forces that promoted this remapping, this new horizontal cooperation in the region, and that for all practical purposes created a new environment in which the foreign policy, in particular trade policies of Latin American countries, would progress. Those four factors are the emergence of Brazil, number one, the emergence of UNASUR. Let me write that down. The emergence of an organization called UNASUR, the emergence of another organization called ALBA, and finally, the emergence of CELAC. So these are the four kind of strategies, the four organizations that were invented, the four factors that led to a new relationship of Latin America with the United States, and they were all somehow oriented or based on the redefinition of economic relations with the hegemon in the north. So let's go one by one. The first one is the emergence of Brazil. Brazil is not a secret, you already know that. Is the most powerful, the bigger, the most populated, the, the, the country with the largest GDP in Latin America. As of 2018, that country had 208 million people. If you if you do the math, it's about six times the population of Canada, and the size of the country is 8.5 million square kilometers, which is about four-fifths the size of Canada. So we're talking about a huge country, very powerful, with plenty of natural resources. That in that year, also 2018, had a nominal gross domestic product of 2.2 trillion US dollars. But if you convert that nominal GDP into a purchasing power party, we discussed that in this course earlier, it goes up to 3.2 trillion dollars produced in 2018 in Brazil. Brazil is also member of the so-called BRICS group, those emerging uh, uh, economies, emerging powers in the world that have, are challenging right now the dominance of the traditional countries in the world. So beyond the United States and Europe, the ones that kind of created the Second World War, the post Second World War order in the world. Now we have the BRICS, meaning Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Uh, an informal gathering of these emerging economies, emerging powers, that is, contending for the first ranks of power, influence, and wealth in the world. Brazil is one of them, and it is then by definition an emerging power in Latin America. Uh, Also, Brazil, when it was governed by the Workers' Party, was one of the countries that flushed down the free trade agreement of the Americas in the 2005 meeting in Argentina. The reason why Brazil was against this agreement was disagreement over objectives of the liberal model of trade liberalization. That is to say, contesting the assumptions of neoliberalism that the market must prevail, that there is a limited role for the state, and all that, and was in favor more of a policy of diversification and managed liberalization of the economy and the international trade of that country. So the free trade agreement of the Americas and similar multilateral dealings are a threat to Brazil's priorities that is interested in promoting South-South cooperation. So, in other words, Brazil would rather have horizontal relations where its weight, its size can feel stronger than having hierarchical relations with the United States. So, this contestation of US leadership is actually quite good for Brazil because now they can claim the role of leaders of the region in a more comfortable way. Moreover, Brazil is also a military power. The size of its army is sizable. They have good equipment for a modern army. And in 2010, uh, the government of Brazil was able to sign cooperation agreement with the United States that is about horizontal cooperation. In other words, Brazil is no longer considered a subordinate, but an actual partner of the United States for defense and military purposes, which is kind of a step up in the rank of global powers for Brazil. Uh, Brazil, through the action of a very sophisticated foreign service called the Itamaraty Academy, have also participated in issues that are not directly of the interest of the country, but that also only show their influence in global affairs. For instance, they attempted a mediation in the Middle East jointly with Turkey for the demilitarization of Iran. So it was one of the efforts that were displayed before the United States decided to invade the country. So in the end, this mediation that Brazil attempted was not very successful, but the very fact that Brazil was getting interested in doing something beyond its borders, even if it was not um, to its immediate benefit, was showing how important um, the, the weight of the country had become in global affairs. Okay, moving on to the following factor that has kind of promoted this remapping trend in Latin America is the creation of UNASUR. UNASUR means the Union of South American Nations, and this is an organization that was created in 2007. Uh, it used to be called the South American Community of Nations, and the name of South American Union was also considered, but in Spanish, South American Union uh, would be Unión Sudamericana, and the acronym would be USA. So it didn't quite fit, excuse me, into the plans. That was not the message that they wanted to convey. So they settled for this name, uh, Union of South American Nations, or UNASUR for its Spanish acronym. So what is UNASUR? It is a union of 12 member countries, all based in South America, that aims at building a customs union along the European model with a political cooperation. UNASUR has a website where they present all of their policies, and the link is going to be posted in e-class, so you can check it out. Uh, and it is a very ambitious project of creating kind of a continental space for trade, of course, but also for cooperation in many areas. So UNASUR comprises what they call the South American Defense Council, then an Institute for Regional Infrastructure of South America that basically wants to carry out projects that link or that are uh, of some service to countries, like for instance, a road that was non-existent before, connecting the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic through the Amazon jungle. It is a project that was difficult to achieve because it involves cooperation of several countries. It's very costly. It requires the a huge amount of investment. But thanks to the cooperation promoted by UNASUR, this project was completed. Also, UNASUR promoted the creation of a single uh, oil company called Petrosur that stabilizes um, and regulates the market of oil in the region. Aurora Graham, hi, sorry, I was a couple of minutes late to the lecture, but here now. Okay, welcome, Aurora. Um, the first president of UNASUR was the former Argentinian president, Nestor Kirchner. And ever since, every year, the presidency is rotated among the member countries to convey the message, and that this is a multilateral organization where all the countries are treated on an equal footing. And the headquarters of the organization is in Quito, in Ecuador. So it's not in one of the larger countries. So So the idea that it is kind of a Brazilian club of nations or an Argentinian club is not understood that way. The third kind of factor, the third effort that was made along this path of remapping or horizontal cooperation in Latin America is the creation of ALBA. ALBA means that ALBA was created in 2004, and it means the Bolivarian Alliance for the People of Our Americas. Sometimes ALBA is also called the TCP, People's Trade Agreement, and it is intended to be a club, an organization for the cooperation, or again, horizontal cooperation of countries in Latin America, but with an explicit rejection of neoliberal objectives and promoting the objectives of social justice, of equality among peoples, of solidarity across borders. Uh, in fact, this is what explains the kind of subtitle or the other title that is given to ALBA, the People's Trade Agreement, because they say this is not a trade agreement for corporations, this is for the people. And also the very name ALBA, I said, that means, as I said, Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our Americas. But in Spanish, ALBA is also the word for down, when the sun rises. And the creators of this organization did that on purpose to convey the message that it was a new dawn for Latin America. Well, it's a bit cheesy, but that's kind of the idea they wanted to convey. Um, so ALBA is a more radical bloc, more radical than UNASUR, that opposes neoliberal regionalism. The original members of ALBA were Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, but after that, countries such as Ecuador, Bolivia, and three Caribbean countries, one of those small islands, Antigua, Dominica, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, joined the agreement as well. So it's not very big, not very comprehensive. It is not. It is certainly the members are certainly less impressive, less important than um, UNASUR, but the contents or the goals of the agreement are perhaps more ambitious. More ambitious because they don't want to promote the commodities exchanges, but they are focused on social programs run by governments. They exchange goods and services, sometimes with no cash payment in between. An example that is, classic of the type of things that ALBA promotes is the swap made between Brazil and Cuba, Bolivia and Cuba. Sorry, Brazil is not a member of ALBA, of medical doctors. So Cuba would send medical doctors, and Bolivia would send natural resources, natural gas, liquefied natural gas, for instance, to Cuba, with no cash payment in between, just an exchange of services and goods for the benefit of these two countries. Also, and the same thing with Venezuela, Cuban doctors going to Venezuela in exchange for oil. Um, ALBA is assorted with some institutions too. First one is Telesur, like a transnational television network that I'm going to put the website in e-class as well, that promote kind of the news on the other side of the coin, right? The news that you're not able to see in more mainstream media like CBC or CNN. They present them usually from the perspective of the countries involved in ALBA, but also quite critical of the actings of the United States and other global powers in the world. They also created another cartel of sorts for the production of oil and marketing of oil called Petrocaribe, and they also created a development bank that is called the ALBA Bank. In 2008, the members of ALBA also created an alliance for mutual defense, basically following the example of NATO, uh, um, offering mutual assistance in case of military need, in case of invasion, in case of trouble. The ALBA members would jump to defend one another uh, if the time came at some point. Um, Now, ALBA, to be fair, is compromised. The future of ALBA is compromised with the recent events in Venezuela and Bolivia. In Bolivia, we were told with Caitlin's presentation that things are going really bad with the new with the coup d'état that was orchestrated against President Morales in last year, October last year. And in Venezuela, it's a government that is having a hard time controlling, um, the basic functions of the state, let alone the commitments with other countries. So the question is open, right? What would happen if, as many signs are indicating right now, the United States promoted an invasion to Venezuela? Would the other ALBA countries jump to defend Venezuela? I'm not very sure about that. And finally, the last element, the last piece in this remaking effort is another organization called CELAC. CELAC was created in 2010, and this acronym stands for the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. This is an initiative that is more ambitious than the previous two that I mentioned, UNASUR and ALBA, because CELAC wants to uh, become a club of 31 countries in the Americas. Basically, all of the countries in the Americas are invited to join CELAC, except for two, United States and Canada. Those are the only two countries in the Americas that are not welcome into CELAC. Not necessarily because Canada is seen as the enemy, but mostly because the purpose of CELAC is promoting a horizontal corporation where there is no claim for leadership from any country in the region. CELAC was launched in Cancun, Mexico, in 2010, and all of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, for that matter, are invited, including Cuba. Cuba is a very interesting case because from the very beginning, that country was invited to join CELAC. And this is an important symbolic gesture because Cuba was excluded from the OAS, Organization of American States, in 1962. You might remember my lecture last week. And was not accepted until 2009, when in this kind of new policy that the Obama government promoted of getting closer to the Americas, regaining leadership in the region, Cuba was invited to rejoin the OAS. But interestingly, Cuba said, no, thank you. I'm not interested anymore. I would rather join CELAC. So Cuba is a full member of CELAC, but not of the OAS. So CELAC called for a true Latin America alliance, again, rejecting U.S. hegemony, rejecting the Washington Consensus, rejecting kind of the approach that the FTAA was promising to have. But they are not ideological or one-sided, as ALBA, for instance, is. CELAC wants to be diverse, wants to incorporate countries with different types of government, different type approaches to social policy, to economic policy. So, for instance, two countries that were in very different ideological sides, Chile and Venezuela, drafted the charter. And the organization at the time, Chile was governed by Sebastián Piñera, a right-wing um, politician, who is president still now, again, uh, currently. And in this drafting of the charter, they were assisted by Brazil, Jamaica, Mexico. So the point of CELAC is to build some type of a balance of regional powers, ideologies. So there is no claim for unilateral leadership, and especially not claim for a single ideology. Um, so the headquarters of CELAC is not in Mexico, the country that had the initiative of creating this, but it's split in three: Caracas, Venezuela; Sao Paulo in Brazil; and Havana in Cuba. But interestingly, they also have offices, representative offices in other parts of the world: Istanbul in Turkey, Cairo in Egypt, Frankfurt, Germany, Moscow, Russia, Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and even one office in Montreal in Canada. So it is a very ambitious organization that is still growing, and that we might see becoming increasingly an important player in international affairs, representing Latin American interests. This time not led by the United States. This time not uh, oriented towards a trade policy alone, but you know, representing the priorities of the area, of the region, independently from other powers. Okay, as usual, I invite you to send questions, comments, if you want me to elaborate on anything. Um, I can sort of divert or take some time in the lecture, so we can address your interest. Well, okay, there is someone called virtualizing reality that has just arrived. I don't know who that is. Um, and he or she is asking, can we start over? Well, we're kind of halfway through, so I cannot really start over. But I'm about to start the discussion of the last reading assigned for this course, which is the one written by Peter Rashish from the Atlantic Council. Um, so, what is the main thesis in that? Um, in that in that reading, well, you can find that main thesis on page 7, by the end of page 7, and I'm going to read it out loud. Latin America has the potential to become a linchpin of a new multipolar global trade constellation. This is true on an east-west axis, considering Latin America's role within the Asia-Pacific sphere, and on a north-south axis with deeper hemispheric integration and stronger European Union, Latin America trade links on the horizon. So there you go. The main idea, the main thesis that Peter Rashish wants to defend here is that Latin America is the linchpin at the center of an emerging trade regime in the world. Why is that? Because there are two major initiatives that are changing the landscape of global trade in the world. The first one being the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the second one being the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Those organizations that cover the Pacific Basin and the Atlantic, the North Atlantic oceans, they both offer the opportunity to expand global trade among crucial economic regions, assorted with new rules for fairer trade. And guess what? Latin America is at the center of these two agreements. In other words, Latin America participates both on the Atlantic and Pacific economic networks. And that's why it is, according to Peter Rashish, at the heart of both the transatlantic and trans-Pacific negotiations, where many of the most significant future moves of the global economic chessboard are likely to play out. So this is again a result of the failure of the FTAA, the Free Trade Agreement of the Americans. So following the policy that Robert Zoellick designed of creating agreements with countries that were willing and able to do it, these two mega trade deals emerged: the TPP, involving 12 Pacific countries, and the TTIP, involving the United States and the European Union. Those two agreements include over 60% of the global GDP in the global GDP. So, of all the wealth, 60% of all the wealth created in the world are involved in these two agreements. Both agreements are comprehensive. That is to say, that they include regulations, they include trade policy, of course, investment policy, uh, intellectual property rights, protection for investors, labor and environmental regulations. So they are very ambitious, very expansive, and they go in the direction of positive integration, similar to what we see happening in the European Union. These two deals are creating rules that redefine the global trade. They are not yet quite successful, but they are work in progress, in which, as I said a minute ago, Latin America plays an important role. Uh, there are three Latin American countries participating in the TPP: Mexico, Peru, and Chile. And 10 of them, and there are 10 that have agreements with either the United States or the European Union, or both. So three on the Pacific side, 10 on the Atlantic side. Um, this will no doubt benefit from the TTP, or may even seek their inclusion in the transatlantic agreement. Um, Latin America, Peter Rashish adds, has an incentive to move on the trade front because the terms of exchange of foreign trade of the region have deteriorated lately. Um, Increase of imports, the fall of the commodity prices, of the merchandises sold by Latin American countries to the rest of the world have decreased. And also, it is important, always important, to diversify the export markets. So, the three countries on the Pacific side, the 10 countries on the Atlantic side, they have the opportunity to expand their links, expand their trade with the rest of the world thanks to these agreements. Now, Peter Rashish asks a fundamental, some of the countries in the region, oops. Okay, it was disconnected for a little while, but I think it came back. Uh, yeah, so some countries in the region are very activist in the sense that uh, they have established trade agreements with many parts of the world. Mexico, 90% of its trade is made within free trade agreements. 64 of its gross domestic product depends from foreign trade. That is a very good example in point. On the downside, there is Brazil, Latin America's largest economy, that is not so willing to play an active role in the international trade agreements. This is kind of a paradox, but that is easy to understand. The largest economy, the most powerful country, wants to be a leader in global affairs, and yet it is not as trade active as other countries in the region with the rest of the world. Why? Because Brazil is a huge market in itself. They don't need to sell that much abroad in order to make their economy prosper, and they prefer to be as self-reliant as possible instead of depending of import from abroad. This is a situation that is very different from Chile's, for instance, that has a relatively small market and that depends very much on selling their products, agricultural products, copper, wine, to the rest of the world. So they need these trade agreements much more than Brazil does. So Latin America is and is becoming increasingly so an important global player in the trade framed by bilateral agreements outside the World Trade Organization. And the question that Peter Rashish asked is whether Latin America can still play an even more important role in a global trade negotiations. There follows a series of policy recommendations that he makes in order to make that potential be realized. But these are not necessarily uh, a reflection of reality, but rather of the preferences of the other. So we leave the discussion here. So, do you guys have any questions or any comments on this? Because I would like to kind of wrap up the unit so we can move on to other things. Okay, let me pour on some tea. Before I tell you a little bit about my conclusions for the course. So, throughout this course, I believe, and you will tell me if I'm wrong, that I have convincingly demonstrated that Latin America is a region of policy innovation. There are so many things that have been diagnosed, attempted, tried, some of them successful, some of them not so much in the region. But the point has been made. Uh, Latin Americans are not resting idle. They are trying to kind of find creative solutions to some of the social and political issues that they confront, especially since they all became democracies and want to serve their peoples better. So the myths, all the preconceptions of the region as backwards, as lazy, as uh, you know, as being kind of wastelands of corruptions, etc., do not apply um, anymore, at least in the public policy area. And let me tell you something: the areas that we explore are only an indication, are only a sample of all the possible policy areas where this type of creativity, this type of policy innovation occurs. There are other areas where that we could have explored. And let me give you an example. Cable cars. The city of Edmonton is about to build a cable car that will help people across the North Saskatchewan River, and it is seen mostly as a tourist attraction. But guess what? In many cities in Latin America, cable cars are used as an everyday way of transporting people that is efficient, that is cheap, that is fast, and it is integrated with the public transit. So it is not only to have nice views of the city, but also to cut distances over traffic. So at least let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 cities in Latin America are fully functional, fully operational, and provide this type of service. They are in Medellin, in Colombia, in Oruro, in Bolivia, Santiago in Chile, in Ecatepec in Mexico, Zacatecas, Mexico as well, Cali in Colombia, Caracas in Venezuela, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, La Paz in Bolivia, and Bogota in Colombia. So this is another area that where Latin America has also found interesting ways of solving a problem. This particular issue is public transit that you know has not necessarily been incorporated massively in other parts of the world, but that has shown that it is convenient, that it is a practical solution to an existing problem. Another thing that I think was shown in this course is that Latin America is no longer under the shadow of the United States. It is not the backwater. It is not the backyard of the United States anymore. That stereotype, that idea has to be uh, forgotten because it's not real anymore. Uh, this all means that both from the academic and from the government or public policy side of things, there is an advantage of considering Latin America as a role model for the world. So now that you know, now that you have accumulated many new data, new information from countries that you probably never considered before, it is your turn to spread the word out, to tell other people, the kind of interesting things that are being tried in Latin America. So you help dispel this myth about the region. So just to finish, thanks for your persistence, for your understanding. I tried to do my best in these difficult circumstances, but hopefully, the whole process didn't suffer too much, and I ended up transmitting what I wanted to do, what I offered you to do at the beginning of the term. Okay, now it's a final exam time. Um, Let me just find it. It's here. Um, I'm going to post it in a minute. Please bear with me. Final exam. Okay, the questions are posted. I need you guys to tell me if you're able to read them. At least one confirmation, so I know that you're able to read them. So go to eClass, by the end, there is a section called Final Exam, and you have the questions there. Can you see them? Aurora, are you still there? Perfect. Aurora is confirming that the questions are there. So, just for Aurora and perhaps for those who are going to watch the stream later, the lecture later, um, let me just explain briefly what it is all about. Um, the exam is divided into parts. The first one is a mandatory question, and then there is a section for optional questions. The mandatory question that is worth 20% of the final grade is asking you to identify 5 governance areas where Latin America can offer lessons to Canada that can inspire solutions to current issues affecting Canada. So it's not difficult to identify. We've discussed that in class many times. Just a matter of choosing 5 of those and explaining how exactly those issues can be solved with Latin American lessons in mind. And the second part is about choosing 2 out of 7 of options that you have there, uh, and answer the questions. The first question, the mandatory question, is about 4 double-space pages, and the optional questions are 2 double-space pages. So it's not very difficult to do 8 pages, but as usual, I would suggest that you think about the answers before you even start writing, so you make the best use of the space possible. Uh, so, do you have any questions? The exam, the answers are due, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, Tuesday next week, April 14th, at any time. Just email them to me, and I'll be happy to check that for you. So, if you have no questions now, you can always email me, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. So anyway, this is it. It's going to be 1 hour since we started. So be careful, stay safe, take care, and it was great meeting you. Bye.